Today, my guest and book that we're going to be talking about is a little unusual. My guest is author Sam Kean, who will talk about his new book, The Disappearing Spoon and Other True Tales of Madness, Love, and the History of the World from the Periodic Table of the Elements from Little Brown and Company Publishers. Now, Sam spent years collecting mercury from broken thermometers as a kid, and now he's a science writer in Washington, D.C. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Mental Floss, Slate, Air and Space, Smithsonian, and New Scientist. In 2009, he was a runner-up for the National Association of Science Writers Everett Clark Seth Payne Award for Best Science Writer under the age of 30. Can you believe that? He currently writes for Science and is a 2009-10 Middlebury Environmental Journalism Fellow. Well, Sam, welcome to the club.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's nice to have you here on the show. You know, I want to start out, first of all, by asking you to give a brief overview of the book.
Well, the premise of the book was to find a spooky or interesting or funny story about every single element on the periodic table. Even if you didn't get a whole lot else out of your chemistry class in high school, probably the one thing you do remember is the periodic table hanging over your teacher's shoulder. And I knew there were really great stories out there about elements that you never get to talk about in class. And I also knew there were a lot of fun, sort of hidden, unknown stories about elements that people thought they were familiar with. And the point of the book was to gather all of those stories into one place.
Okay. For those people who perhaps never took chemistry, what is the periodic table?
The periodic table basically is a way to organize all of the elements. An element is a fundamental building block of the universe. It's something that you can't break down under normal circumstances. And there are dozens and dozens of different types of these building blocks. You could think about arranging them by color or by abundance or by any number of ways. And what the periodic table does is it puts them in columns with other elements that have very similar properties. So you can look at the table and know at a glance how an element will react and what some of its properties are.
Okay. My next question is your reason for writing this book. I think that's an important question, and I'm anxious to hear your answer.
The reason for writing it was, as I said, I knew all of these stories from the time that I was young. I gravitated toward teachers who would tell these stories, and I really wanted to get them all into one place. And I knew also that people can learn a lot more than they might think just by learning stories and hearing stories about people on the periodic table.
All right. Now, the book is coming out at a good time because, of course, classes are starting all over the country, all over the world. Is there a particular audience that you're trying to reach?
Just a general science reader, someone who is interested in science. It certainly doesn't take any sort of technical background to read the book, and I think it would be something that you could use in a classroom or for teaching purposes because people really remember stories. It's just kind of how our brains work. They work better to remember narratives than they do sort of isolated facts, and that's really what the book is full of, is narratives and stories.
Okay, that was going to be my next question then. What is it about this book, that may get people to learn more? But so you're saying that by presenting these stories, it's going to be a learning tool, that it's going to make it easier for them, or else they're going to become more interested in the subject? Is that what you're saying?
I definitely think so. As I said, our brains just work to remember stories better, and I think the book is infused with a lot of humor and some touching tales. as well, things that people really will remember. And there's a lot of stories about scientists on there, both well-known scientists and scientists that or that deserve to be more well-known because of the great and, well, sometimes disreputable things that they did.
Yes, and we're going to get into the specifics on that because I agree with that. I found some of those stories fascinating, and some I just shook my head at. So we will get into that. But let's start out by your explaining where the elements come from, how they developed.
Well, the elements, hydrogen specifically, it came from the Big Bang that started off our universe. All the elements after that basically come from stars. Stars are mostly hydrogen, and they fuse hydrogen together to make helium. And stars about the size of our sun then can make a few elements beyond that. So smaller stars are responsible for making elements up to about iron. Beyond iron, you have to go to what's known as a supernova, which is an enormous explosion of a very big star. And that's how you get all of the other natural elements down to about uranium. And the fact, of course, that we have on Earth a lot of the elements that are heavier than iron shows that we had one of these supernova explosions somewhere in our past, and possibly more than one of them.
I must admit, I had a little trouble with that explanation when I was reading it, and I'm sure this is something that we all ask. We understand to some degree the Big Bang theory, and we understand certain things, and we understand the supernova. But so what you're saying is that we had to have one of these Big Bang things that created the Earth, if you want to put it that way. And now you're saying another aspect of that is it comes from the stars. Okay, how does it get from the stars into our universe?
Well, the Big Bang is actually what started the universe and created it. And it's the supernova, which is kind of like you could think of it as a mini Big Bang.
A mini Big Bang, I like that.
A mini Big Bang, yes. It's a very large star that collapses on itself. And when it collapses, it gets immensely hot, and the pressure is immensely great, far greater than anything you could ever find on Earth. And it just squishes all the particles together so tightly that they can form heavy elements. And then that's unstable when it's so hot and there's such great pressure. It explodes, and it sends those elements scattering out across the universe. And some of them ended up in a solar system like ours and ended up forming planets like Earth.
Okay, well, that's a great explanation. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Now, let's talk about the periodic table, because you had some interesting things in the book about that, too. And this is kind of a multiple question.
Okay.
Who developed the periodic table? How did it develop, and why? And how should we read or interpret it?
Well, the first question, who developed the periodic table? The name most people remember is Dmitry Mendeleev, who was a Russian chemist. But actually, if you look at the history, there were 5 other scientists who created something very similar to the periodic table at the same time. It was definitely an idea that was in the air. Some of them ran into some bad luck. One of them, for instance, compared the elements on the periodic table to notes on a musical scale that sort of repeat at regular intervals. And it was a hard analogy for people to grasp, and it was a little too whimsical. And so his ideas really fell out of favor when he might have earned more credit for it. Mendeleev gets a lot of the credit because he was able to put more elements into the first tables. And, of course, they didn't know about all of the elements that we do today. But Mendeleev left gaps on his table, and he predicted that new elements would be found, and he was even able to predict the properties of new elements based on where the holes were. And when other scientists discovered these new elements and they realized that the predictions matched exactly what Mendeleev had thought, they were astounded. They could not believe that someone sitting in a lab in Russia had been able to predict what would happen out in the field like that. It became really a powerful tool for explaining the building blocks of the universe after Mendeleev's predictions came true.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But what was the reason for its development? Was it just thought of as being a tool to help people understand it? It was more than that.
What they really wanted to do was they wanted to get a way to organize the elements and to cluster together the elements that have similar properties so that you could predict how they might react. Mm-hmm. And what the table does is it takes similar elements and puts them in the same column. And that way a scientist can look at that column and know that, for instance, if carbon reacts a certain way, then the element below it, which is silicon, will probably also react in generally the same way.
Okay. So then the third part of the question is, how is one supposed to read it or interpret it? Is there a right way or a wrong way? Like kids in school that are taking chemistry, how are they taught to interpret it? By what you just said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's easy to read the periodic table left to right because that's how we read a text, but often you have to read the periodic table up and down as well. It's like there's some forms of Japanese, for instance, you read up and down. So you have to get used to reading in a little bit of a different way. The other thing that's important to know is that a lot of the elements on the table, over 3/4 of them, are metals. And the variety on the periodic table really comes in the top right quadrant. That's where you get a lot of the nonmetals, where you get many of the gases. Some of the liquids are over there. So that's another thing is if you think about it as sort of the northeast quadrant of the United States, if it were a map, that would be where a lot of the variety was. Whereas on the rest of the periodic table, you have a lot of metals, and sometimes they're a little harder to tell apart.
Okay. You had mentioned carbon and silicone, and that I got a kick out of what you described as a word that's ridiculously long that has 1,185 letters, carbon-based protein. Can you even pronounce that word?
I could pronounce it if you were willing to give me a few minutes of airtime. I'm sure I could get through it, but not in one breath. As you said, it's over 1,000 letters long, and it's the longest word that's ever appeared in print in English.
Wow.
And as you said, it's carbon-based because of the properties of carbon. Carbon is very good about forming complex chains and rings and webs of atoms. And when you get into our bodies especially, you get these very, very long proteins, and that happens to be the longest one that has ever appeared in print, was the 1,185-letter word.
Well, I even tried pronouncing the 45-letter medical thing, the non-technical word. I really tried to do that, and boy, I couldn't do that at all. So
I think it was pseudo-ultramicroscopic volcanosilicoconiosis, something like that.
Something like that. Well, yep. I'll take your word for it. I'm not even going to try. Now, we're going to have to take a break in a minute, and I'm talking to Sam Kean about his new book, The Disappearing Spoon and Other True Tales of Madness, Love, and the History of the World from the Periodic Table of the Elements. So, Sam, hold on, and we'll be right back. I want to ask you, Sam, is what's the story behind the title?
Well, the disappearing spoon comes from an element called gallium. It's a metal that sits right below aluminum on the periodic table, and they have very similar properties. If you had a hunk of gallium sitting in front of you and a hunk of aluminum sitting in front of you, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart. except gallium has one unusual property. It melts at a little above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So even if you had it sitting in the palm of your hand, it would start to soften up and melt. And the disappearing spoon comes in because it's sort of a classic nerdy science prank to make a spoon out of gallium and to serve it to somebody with hot coffee or tea. And the person getting the coffee or tea, of course, doesn't know that it's made of gallium. They assume it's aluminum or something. But they figure out something unusual is going on when they start to stir, and the head of the spoon disappears on them.
Well, what a fun way to present an
Maybe
element.
Fun after you explain it.
Yeah,
Alarming,
after
possibly.
you explain it. That's true. Let's talk about now. I want to jump to one question that I was going to ask you later, but I think this would be a good time since you mentioned also aluminum. First part of the question is, what's your favorite element, and what's the deadliest element? And then talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition. I thought that was really fascinating.
Okay. My favorite element is definitely mercury. It's the one that I first really knew about from breaking thermometers as a kid. And what really captivated me about it later was not just that it was such a gorgeous element, but that it has such a long history. And as you said, it actually popped up with the Lewis and Clark expedition. There was a doctor in Philadelphia named Benjamin Rush. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the founding fathers. And he had a pet treatment that he would give people. It was mercury chloride sludge. It was not very good for them, but doctors had different ideas about what was good medicine at the time. It was
that when I read that part, that really blew my mind.
It was sort
talk
of
about that.
It was the idea of kind of fighting poison with poison, that if your body was having bad reactions, you had to fight it with something just as powerful. So he would give them this mercury chloride solution. And Lewis and Clark come in because Dr. Rush had these patented pills that he called Dr. Rush's bilious pills. And he packed 600 of them with Lewis and Clark when they went to explore the Louisiana Territory. And unfortunately, there's no delicate way to put it, but they were basically very powerful laxatives.
Right.
Because your body doesn't want mercury in it, and if you swallow some, it wants to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The idea was that if Lewis and Clark ate something that was either poisonous or really didn't agree with them, they could take some of these pills and probably feel better. And the interesting part, I thought, was that historians and archaeologists have actually been able to pinpoint a few places where they know Lewis and Clark must have stayed because the concentration of mercury in the soil was much higher than it would have been naturally.
How did they survive that? Because certainly mercury, it causes your hair to fall out and all sorts of things, and you can die from it, right? So how in the world did their group get through all of that? I mean, this is only supposition, but it's a interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, there are different ways of being exposed to mercury. If you take some, obviously it's not good for you, but it's definitely more of a problem if it's chronic. And what's even worse, and what causes a lot of problems with mercury exposure, is the fumes of mercury. Those are especially bad for you.
I see. Yeah. What's the deadliest element?
The deadliest element is generally considered to be thallium, which is kind of a rare element. And the reason it's considered so deadly is that it's poisonous in very small quantities, and just a little bit of it can do an outsized amount of damage. It goes into your body and it sort of unstitches the proteins inside you. And it's even been called the poisoner's poison before because it's been a favorite tool of some serial killers and some dictators through history.
Wow. That's scary. You had another a story that you wanted to talk about, and that was aluminum, because you mentioned that some people think the gallium is aluminum. So tell us that story.
Well, this was one of the stories that popped up in my research that I hadn't known about before, and I was really fascinated by it because it was a hidden story about aluminum, which we see around us all the time. And in the 1800s, aluminum was actually the most precious metal on Earth. It was worth far more than gold, far more than silver. And the reason why is, even though aluminum is common in the Earth's crust, it's very hard to get a pure sample of it. So when chemists were making small pure samples, it was considered sort of a miracle substance. It's very light but very strong, and it also has nice, attractive look to it. And the French actually used to put Fort Knox-like bars of aluminum and display them next to their crown jewels. They were very proud of them. And the Emperor Napoleon III had a set of aluminum cutlery that he would use for his most favored guests, and the lesser nobility that visited him actually had to use gold and silver cutlery,
poor
knives
things.
and forks.
Isn't that amazing? Now, let's
Yeah.
see, Napoleon III, that's the late 1800s, is it? Or
Mid to late 1800s,
yeah,
yep.
right.
And the United States even got involved with this. The Washington Monument, even today, has a 6-inch cap of aluminum on the very, very top of it. The reason why was we were kind of bragging a little bit. We were saying that we're such a powerful, up-and-coming country that we can afford to put aluminum on our public monuments.
Oh.
And, of course, today it's sort of a passé metal. And if you brought people from the 1800s to today and they went to, say, a Little League baseball game, they would probably think we were crazy letting these kids run around with aluminum bats worth millions of dollars to them.
Isn't that amazing? That is fascinating. I think you're right about these stories, because certainly I will remember these stories more than I will if I try to read something that's a little more scientific. So that's a great idea. Are you talking at schools and universities and that sort of thing about your book and about the subject?
Yeah, we've started to line some things up. It's still pretty early in the school year, but
right.
There will be a few lectures and talks and readings that I'll be giving at a few places.
Are you going to be doing it at the high school level or the university level, or both? When do you think that students should really start getting into this more?
I think it can be a benefit for both high school and college students. I've had high school students write me and say that this was a great introduction for them. I've also had college students write me and say, I got into studying it, and it was okay. I maybe got a little burnt out, but reading the stories really kind of renewed their interest in it. So I think it can work for both levels.
Good. I want to ask you now about the scientific explanation as to why some areas of the Earth have higher concentrations of some elements than others, and how does this explain why some places are more or less immortalized on the periodic table?
The story you're referring to is a small town in Sweden called Ytterby. It's outside of Stockholm. And in the early days of the Earth, the elements were mixed up pretty uniformly. Earth was kind of molten in liquid, and they were able to move around. But as the Earth cooled down, the elements clumped together. Most elements like to be by similar elements, so you get large clumps of gold or aluminum or other things. And when the Earth cooled down enough, some places just happened to have higher concentrations of elements than others. And this small town called Ytterby in Sweden happen to have a high concentration of what are known as the rare earth metals. They are the elements on the bottom of the periodic table, sort of hanging by themselves. And there are actually 7 different elements on the periodic table that can trace their history to this very tiny island. And there are 4 that can trace their names specifically to this place. You think about all the great chemists that Germany or England or the United States has, but the place that has the most elements named after that is a small suburb of Stockholm. It's pretty amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about, at this point now, briefly, just give us a favorite story about either a male or female scientist, one of your favorites, but do it briefly because I have a couple more things I want to get back to.
One story that I really enjoyed in the book was the story of Lisa Meitner. She was an Austrian scientist who discovered that uranium can split into smaller elements. And she actually discovered this right before World War II, and it led to the Manhattan Project. But she had a very rough go of things. She was Jewish, she was exiled from Germany, and she actually ended up missing out on a Nobel Prize because of it. She had a very tough go of things during the war. So getting into her story was really a fascinating story that I didn't know much about before.
Yeah, but did she ever then receive later recognition, or did she die during the war? Or?
She did not die during the war. She never got recognition in her lifetime, never got a Nobel Prize, but much later she did get an element named after her on the periodic table,
good.
Which is, in fact, much more prestigious than getting a Nobel Prize. There are only 118 elements, but, they give out Nobel Prizes every year.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That's good to hear. Why should we care about the periodic table in chemistry?
You should care about it because it's the fundamental, they are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, the elements are, and they make up everything around you, everything you eat and breathe. And the periodic table intersects with so many different areas of life. You can look at the periodic table in art, or the periodic table in politics, periodic table in biology. So whatever your interest is, you can really find something new and unusual about it by examining the stories and the people on the periodic table.
Okay. Very quickly, I want to talk about a review of your book.
Okay.
I received a copy of and give you this quote. A reviewer states that your book is not about the periodic table, but chemistry, and calls it sleight of hand. She claims by not using the word chemistry in the title, it will help you to reach another audience. And by the way, she did like the book. It's a positive, statement that she's making. I thought that was a little kind of sleight of hand myself for her to refer to as that. How do you react to that statement? Are you not using the word chemistry because you think it will help you reach another audience?
I didn't consciously avoid it. I guess you could make an argument. Sometimes people hear the word chemistry and they don't have a good reaction to it. It might bring up some memories of struggling in school or something. But I really wanted to move beyond chemistry and talk about all of the other things that I just mentioned, the arts, politics, biology. There were so many different areas I wanted to get into that I didn't want to limit the stories to only chemistry.
Okay, so you see a distinct difference then.
I think there's more to the periodic table than just chemistry. Periodic table is definitely fundamental to chemistry, but you can do much more with the periodic table than just talk about chemistry. There are many more stories and fun things to look at.
Yes, which is and you're a storyteller in this instance, in this book.
That's really what the book is. It's stories about the people and the elements on the table. Yes.